Across Georgia, reminders of our state's rich human history abound. From lighthouses to ruined factories and plantations to gravestones, monuments of our past can be found in every corner of the state. Coming up, we'll take a closer look at some of these landmarks, next on Georgia Outdoors.
Funding for Georgia Outdoors has been made possible by a grant from Mary Hall Singleton and by the Imlay Foundation.
They are the silent sentinels of our coast, guarding the channels and shorelines upon which our state was founded. Steadfast and vigilant, each of Georgia's historic lighthouses boasts its own unique architecture, its own contribution to history, its own attraction, as inescapable as the very tides.
Lighthouses have more of a universal appeal than I think any other historic structures I've been involved with.
They're normally located in remarkably beautiful places. There's the beacon of light, the fact that lighthouses have saved countless numbers of lives.
The St. Simon's Island Lighthouse is elegant and stately, belying a bloody past that extends back to the construction of the building itself.
It was very remote, very desolate, and apparently there was a lot of standing water here, which encouraged the breeding of mosquitoes, and in those days one of the big fears from mosquitoes was malaria. In fact, the architect of the new lighthouse, he was bitten, he contracted malaria, as did about half the crew, and they died.
Problems in construction aren't the only legacy of the St. Simon's Lighthouse. Legend has it that other events have left their mark upon the grounds here.
The third lighthouse keeper of the current lighthouse, was a fellow by the name of Frederick Osborne. At one point in time, he and his assistant keeper got into a series of altercations.
History isn't clear on what the two keepers were arguing about, but one thing is certain. The arguments quickly escalated into violence.
And the assistant keeper shot the keeper, Frederick Osborne, dead. And that's where the story gets interesting.
According to the story, the assistant keeper was found not guilty of manslaughter and returned to St. Simon's to continue his care of the lighthouse. But apparently, he didn't return alone.
That's when he started hearing noises, steps going up and down the tower. That's when supposedly furniture started moving. That's when supposedly he'd go up to the tower after having just polished the lens, and he'd find smudges on the glass and things like that. To this day, we've got employees who have had experiences, who have felt presences, a sudden coldness. One of my storekeepers actually claims to have seen a figure and tried to have a conversation with him.
Despite the ghostly presence, or perhaps because of it, the St. Simon's Lighthouse remains a beautiful marker and a fantastic destination. The Tybee Island Lighthouse, located near Savannah, dates all the way back to James Oglethorpe, Georgia's founding father.
General Oglethorpe ordered one to be built on Tybee Island, so he wanted an aid to navigation to mark the channel approach to the Savannah River.
The history of the Tybee Island Lighthouse is one of constant destruction and reconstruction. The location and architecture of the Tybee Light changed several times over the years as wind, rain, and the Civil War all took their toll.
Confederate forces occupied it at first. They realized an attack was forthcoming, so they abandoned the lighthouse, abandoned Tybee Island, snuck back over in the dead of night and set fire to the wooden stairs and landing, and basically destroyed that lighthouse for all intents and purposes.
Despite a past filled with destruction and fire, the Tybee Light remains standing today, renovated, freshly painted, and still serving the port of Savannah.
You see the lighthouse, you know it marks the channel of approach along with other buoys and navigational aids, and you know this is your safe passage up the Savannah River.
A few miles away, between the Tybee Light and Fort Pulaski, sits an unremarkable little island made of shells. Perched upon the tip of that island is the diminutive but still beautiful Cockspur Island Lighthouse. If ever a lighthouse could be described as a survivor, this little light is it. In addition to the normal erosion problems faced by all lighthouses, the Cockspur Island Lighthouse stood directly in the line of fire between Union and Confederate forces during the Civil War.
The coastal forts were designed to shoot ships. As a result, there were no trees, not even tall grass on Cockspur Island, because they were trying to shoot at the waterline of the ships. So the only thing that would have been standing, the only witness that still survives to this day, is the Cockspur Island Lighthouse. And you can imagine the sound. The lighthouse keepers, wherever they were at the time of the battle, they must have seen quite a show, and they must have feared greatly for the welfare of their lighthouse.
Having survived the war between the states, the Cockspur Island Lighthouse now faces the most relentless enemy of all, time. The tiny shell island upon which it sits is slowly succumbing to the forces of nature.
The island itself has been the subject of time, wind, waves, erosion. Today, the island is underwater at all times except extreme low tide. So 80% of the day it's underwater.
Despite these challenges, there are plans to save the lighthouse for the future enjoyment of all.
The future of the lighthouse is a preservation project that will build up the old revetment so that people will have a safe surface to walk on, and the lighthouse itself will remain above water at all tides. If you want to see the lighthouse, you need a boat, because the only time this island exists anymore is at extreme low tide. You can take a hike up 46 feet to the top and get a breathtaking view of the North and South Channel and Tybee Island, and we encourage folks to do so.
Even more remote than the Cockspur Light, the Sapelo Island Lighthouse has a rich history itself. This beautiful red and white striped lighthouse was put in place in 1820 to light the way into the port of Darien.
Darien was the leading timber shipping point on the east coast of the United States from a period of time roughly 1870 to about 1915, and the Sapelo Lighthouse was the primary aid to navigation for international shipping coming into the harbor to load with Georgia pine timber.
Over time, the elements took their toll, leaving the lighthouse badly in need of repair.
In 1995, the state of Georgia undertook a program to restore the Sapelo Island Lighthouse, to actually relight the light and to make it available for public visitation. It was about a one-year actual building project to restore the lighthouse, completed in 1998, and the light was repainted to its original configuration and it was relit.
With such beautiful remote settings, it's easy to imagine the life of the lighthouse keeper as romantic and carefree.
That's probably one of the greatest misconceptions people have about light keepers. Nothing could be further from the truth. It was one of the most regulated, regimented, disciplined bureaus in America in its heyday.
The lighthouse keepers were people who overcame adversity. They were here in the heart of the greatest hurricanes that have passed through the Georgia coast, and they survived those challenges. Sometimes they didn't survive, so there's some great stories that are involved in the lighthouse keepers themselves.
Despite the harsh realities of a lighthouse's existence, these seaside structures have always called out to the imaginations of artists and amateurs, young and old alike.
It's romance, it's danger, it's mystery, it's history.
And they're a reminder of our past, they're a reminder of the best of us.
And it's very important that we maintain a sense of place, that we keep that linkage to our past as a guiding inspiration for our future as well.
Lighthouses provide a link to a specific time and place in Georgia's history. But scattered across our state are thousands of monuments which may be smaller in scale, but are no smaller in their historic significance. Cemeteries are not only places of burial, but places of great history, art, architecture, and serene beauty. From tiny family burial plots to church graveyards to military cemeteries, these places of final rest come in all shapes and sizes across the state.
People have lived in Georgia for more than 12,000 years, so that adds up to a lot of people living here and dying here and probably being buried here. So there are burials scattered all over the state. And I've estimated that we have probably 40,000 cemeteries in Georgia, maybe even more.
Of the thousands of cemeteries in Georgia, a few stand out, and many have even become tourist destinations. Oakland Cemetery in Atlanta is one of those places. Home to the graves of many famous Georgians, including author Margaret Mitchell and golfer Bobby Jones, Oakland attracts visitors from across the country every year.
Oakland was established by the city of Atlanta as a municipal burying ground for all citizens. And so we have all races, religions, and economic income levels from 1850 up until about 1884.
Oakland is also well known for its Civil War history.
The Confederate grounds is a designed landscape. It is virtually the same as it was set up. It has had improvements over the years, but it is clearly a military section with many monuments, one matching the next, in straight rows. It's a very somber area, and it has a beautiful collection of trees that date from about 1888, and we're fortunate enough to have a planting list. And so as we do subsequent plantings, we follow that list. As a design landscape, we want to keep it as intact as possible.
Large historic cemeteries such as Oakland are important not only as burial grounds, but also as iconic reminders of the history of our state.
These large picturesque cemeteries that we have sort of evoke a sense of wonder and mystery about who were these people and why do they have these fabulous monuments in them. Even if you're not a genealogist or you're not a history buff, there's so many things to be interested in a cemetery. They are outdoor museums of sculpture, and they're bird sanctuaries. There are lots of historic plants in cemeteries that you might not find very many other places. I think that there are a lot of reasons to visit a cemetery, and once you get in there and start looking around, you'll realize that there are stories here that you can relate to and will broaden your understanding and your appreciation of the actual community you live in.
All cemeteries, including historic ones like Oakland, require a certain amount of upkeep. Oftentimes, if left unattended, a cemetery may fall into disrepair, and it's up to the citizens of the community to come to its aid. One community that stepped up to the challenge is the city of Washington.
The School Street Cemetery in Washington was a very large African-American cemetery in that community that sort of got forgotten about. Then there was a one-time grant available from our Historic Preservation Office that the City of Washington availed themselves of, and the grant enabled them to start looking at that cemetery and figuring out how to restore it and bring it back to the attention of the community.
It's all pretty dense here.
The community enlisted the help of archaeologists from New South Associates to help map out the grave sites and determine who is buried here.
The first step that any cemetery needs in order to be preserved and managed is a map showing the locations of all the burials. The first step was we had to identify unmarked graves. A lot of the graves out here do not have formal tombstones on them. So we did a probe survey to figure out where graves were, mark those locations. Then we had a survey team using a total station laser transit mapped in all of the locations of both marked and unmarked graves.
Some of the graves in the School Street Cemetery aren't marked with traditional gravestones.
For this particular cemetery, they have a tradition of using stones like field stones, not professionally made stone, as a headstone. So you'll find throughout the cemetery just a stone which may look like it's been there all along, but in actuality that's representing a marker. People who place it know who is there, but of course those generations have died away.
In order to locate unmarked graves around the cemetery, the Georgia Department of Transportation provided ground-penetrating radar, a state-of-the-art technology which uses sonar to locate objects beneath the earth without disturbing potential grave sites.
GPR is ground-penetrating radar, and basically it is an antenna that you run across the ground. It's important to maintain conductivity, which is to the ground. It sends out electrical pulses, radar pulses, and when the signal is received, that's how we know if there's something in the ground. We've had great success with this. We've actually taken this to Andersonville. They asked us to locate where graves had started becoming mass burials instead of single burials, and we actually did some of the work out there, and it was great results.
After the work was done, the city of Washington held a rededication ceremony to honor those buried here and their descendants.
The rededication this morning is really to, I guess, declare victory. We now know what we need to do. So we entered into this project. We didn't know where the graves were. As part of the archaeological work, we found graves out in the woods that we had no idea they were there. They're unmarked, but now they at least will be honored and protected.
They did a beautiful way. Beautiful. It's a good job because it was really bad.
I have a aunt buried out here. It's nice. Looks lots better and get around better. And I appreciate it. Getting cleaned up.
It's really gotten in under my skin. I come out here quite often. It's a very peaceful cemetery, interesting topography. And as you look across the headstones, everything from World War I veterans to a lady minister here who died in 2006, back to the early 1800s.
Cemeteries are ultimately sacred sites. They are places where human beings are buried. Beyond that, of course, cemeteries are storehouses of amazing genealogical information. They're landscapes. A good reason for preserving cemeteries is to keep that little green pocket alive.
A great way to interact with history is through historical societies. Found in almost every town, historical societies are institutions dedicated to the collection, preservation, and distribution of historical knowledge. Most historical societies are funded and managed by a network of volunteers and members. Many historical societies take it upon themselves to preserve historical buildings and other locations within their town. Historical societies are fantastic places to research genealogy, view historic artifacts, or just immerse yourself in history. For more information on how to find an active historical society near you, visit this website.
According to the archaeological record, Georgia has been occupied by humans for over 14,000 years. Across the state, vestiges of our past can be found. From the majestic burial grounds of our Native American forebears to deteriorating plantations and factories, these remnant structures tell us a lot about cultures lost to history.
People have been living in Georgia for the last 12 or 13,000 years, and all through that time period, people built structures of various kinds. You can think of ruins as being divided into two classes, those that you can see when you walk around, and those that are buried beneath the surface of the earth that you can't see and that you can only find with archaeology.
While most structures built by native cultures have been lost to time, one particular native practice left a good deal of physical evidence behind: mound building.
There actually were several periods of time during which Indians built mounds, and for different purposes. Indians built little low mounds sometimes to bury their dead in. They also built mound complexes around 500 to 700 AD. And then later on, just before the Europeans came in, they started building mounds again, and these are sites like Etowah Indian mounds.
The dwellings and buildings associated with these societies have long since vanished, but more recent building practices have left ruins across the state. On the coast, signs of human settlement often come in the form of buildings made from a material called tabby.
Tabby was used throughout the Georgia coastal region in the 18th and first part of the 19th centuries. And it was really a very structurally sound form of construction. Once you pour those courses of tabby and they cure properly and you get a roof over them, tabby structures can last for hundreds of years. The key with tabby is to keep a roof on it. If tabby is exposed to water, it gradually erodes, and so many of the structures on the Georgia coast that don't have roofs are gradually disappearing back into the earth.
Many of these structures lie scattered across our barrier islands. On Cumberland Island, you can visit the remains of Dungeness, an estate once owned by the Carnegie family. The remote chocolate plantation site on Sapelo is another such place with a rich history.
The tabbies that you see at Chocolate Plantation are primarily the result of one of the plantation owners who lived there in the early 1800s, a sea captain by the name of Swarbeck. But chocolate actually has occupation layers going way back further than that. There were Indians there, of course, in the prehistoric period, and then in the 18th century, in the middle part of the 1700s, Chocolate Plantation was settled. The tabby ruins themselves that you see at Chocolate include 2 rows of slave cabins, the big house that Swarbeck lived in, and various kinds of outbuildings, including a wonderful barn structure that was restored in the early part of the 20th century by Howard Coffin, the famous car manufacturer who owned Chocolate Plantation and much of Sapelo Island.
Away from the coast, brick and stone structures have stood the test of time, and several are easily accessed by the public. At Sweetwater Creek State Park stands the remains of the New Manchester Manufacturing Company textile mill. During the Civil War, Sherman's troops destroyed the mill and the adjacent town. Today, the mill run and the 3-story walls of the mill building are all that's left of what was once a thriving factory and the community which was dependent upon it.
It was a 5-story brick building. We were have been assured that that 5-story building was taller than any building in Atlanta at the time. The building was primarily cotton producing. In July of 1864, units from Illinois and Kentucky, federal units came through. They burned the factory. After the war, the factory was not rebuilt, and the whole area fell into disuse. It was being used primarily as a playground for locals.
Today, these ruins are protected within the boundaries of a state park, easily accessed by trail. North of Atlanta, another iconic landmark stands as a reminder of life and industry in Georgia before the Civil War. Cooper's Furnace at Allatoona Lake was once the centerpiece of a thriving iron industry in the since-vanished town of Etowah, a city which relied upon iron production for its survival.
The old town of Etowah had been a flourishing town in the 1800s and had been burned during the Civil War by Sherman's troops on his march to Atlanta. At one time, the Etowah Iron Works had employed 4,000 people. It was owned by Mark Cooper, who was also one of the major people in Georgia to bring in the Western and Atlantic Railroad to this area. All that's left of the ironworks is just the furnace itself. It's a huge stone structure. We have several trails leading out behind the furnace, and it's just a very popular area for people that come to this area.
While structures like Cooper's Furnace are monuments which are easy to see, much of our structural history has been lost to fire, weather, or simple deterioration. Archaeologists across the state are hard at work uncovering evidence of these structures through clues beneath the ground.
I think one of the things that makes Georgia unique is that we are very interested in our heritage here. We have a very strong sense of where we came from and our past. And archaeology tells us the story of who we are and how we got to where we are today in ways that written history cannot.
One period of history that's of great interest to archaeologists in Georgia is that of first contact between Native Americans and the Europeans. Near the banks of the Mulgee River in middle Georgia, a group of archaeologists is studying one such site.
This was an Indian community first and foremost, and the most common artifacts we find here reflect that. And certainly the most common artifact are broken pieces of Indian pottery.
The group has made several important discoveries, which lead them to believe this site was visited by the Spanish.
The objects of Spanish origin that we have are primarily beads. They're little tiny glass beads about the size of a pea. The other object we found just this morning appears to be a part of a pointed weapon of some kind. We're finding these Spanish artifacts mixed into a deposit with Indian artifacts that we think represents a living surface. We'll call it a floor. Now that floor may actually be the literal floor of a building. We have evidence of post holes that would have supported the structure. We have material called daub, which was the clay packed onto the walls of those buildings. So it all adds up to some kind of a special structure.
Archaeology is a painstaking process, and a lot of techniques are used to ensure that no artifact is disturbed.
The goal with the trowel is to keep it flat, keep it kind of at an angle, and you're trying to get the floor flat. You go in systematic passes. And we do it that way so that if we come upon an artifact, we don't just chunk it out, and we'll know exactly where it came from. We want to know so that later on we can come and look at it and see where the concentrations are. If there's a big pile of pottery here or a big pile of daub here, that'll be important later on.
This work is important because it helps us to reconstruct a significant period of Georgia's history and our history as a society.
Architecture from Georgia's past is essentially invisible at this point without the help of archaeologists. There's very, very little or often zero above ground evidence of where most of the buildings that ever existed in this state once were.
Whether clues in the ground, structures weathered through time, monuments to those who came before us, or majestic guardians of our coast, Georgia's rich history has left a mark on our landscape. Monuments of our past can be found throughout the state for you to explore and discover.
Funding for Georgia Outdoors has been made possible by a grant from Mary Hall Singleton and by the Imlay Foundation.